So, I am a massive fan of rereading books. I get very attached to characters and to worlds, and I really love to revisit them, and naturally I have therefore done a lot of rereading in the year of 2019. And mostly I have discovered that audiobooks are a fantastic way for me to do that rereading, because I can chuck the speed way up to 2 or 2.5, and then I can get through lots of rereading in the year. Plus, I just find it easier to follow the story on audio if I have read it previously, so if I miss a few bits it really doesn't matter because I already know the story and I already know what's going to happen. So here are all of the books that I reread in 2019. I have a massive pile of reread books right next to me, and I'm not going to tell you about them in the order that I reread them. I'm just going to tell you them as they come to me, starting off with a few that I don't actually have physical copies of. So firstly, I did reread the Mistborn trilogy, First Era by Brandon Sanderson, and I loved it just as much the second time as I did the first time. To be honest, I'm not going to review any of these because if I reread them, you can take it as presumed that I loved them. So Mistborn is an epic fantasy series that is set in a world with a very interesting magic system called allomancy, which involves the consumption of and burning of metals in order to gain certain abilities. I'm not going to go in depth because it's a very complicated magic system, but it is one of my absolute favourite magic systems in any book that I have ever read. I also reread the Monsters of Verity duology by V.E. Schwab, or Victoria Schwab as she is also known, and this is a somewhat dystopian fantasy duology about a world, our world, but where all of a sudden the bad deeds that are done by man have turned into monsters. And there are 3 different types of monsters. So if you commit a violent act, you create the Corsai, which are kind of zombie-like, ghost-like creatures. And then if you murder somebody, you create a Malkai, which is essentially a vampire. And then there's a 3rd type of monster called a Sunai, of which very little is known. And we are in the city of Verity, which is a city divided. One side is fighting a war against the monsters, and the other side is weaponizing the monsters, essentially. And we follow August Flynn and Kate Harker, who are the children of the people at the top of each side of the city. And naturally, their worlds collide, as often happens in young adult literature. And I really love this duology, and I really enjoyed the audiobooks, actually. I hadn't listened to the audiobooks before, and they were really good. Highly recommend. And finally, for the ones that I don't own, I reread the Hunger Games trilogy, or technically I've currently reread the first 2 in the trilogy, and I'm about halfway through the final book in the trilogy, but I feel comfortable talking about it because I'm going to finish Mockingjay tomorrow. But I really don't feel like this needs an explanation of the plot because it's so well known, but it's kind of like a young adult version of Battle Royale, if you've ever seen that film. Essentially, far future of the human race, post-apocalypse, mankind is reasserting itself, and following an uprising, the capital set up something called the Hunger Games, where children from the 12 districts are selected once a year to enter into a battle to the death. And it's very brutal, and it's great, and I love it, and I've reread it many, many times, and I will probably reread it many, many more times because it is fantastic, and the audiobook's pretty good too. Moving on to the books that I have physical copies of, let's get Sanderson out of the way, shall we? I reread Warbreaker, which is one of his standalone novels that is also epic fantasy and follows two sisters. One sister is the carefree youngest princess who really has no responsibility because there are no expectations on what she will do in her life, and the other is the eldest sister who is very perfect in every way because she has to be, because all the expectation is on her. And then their roles end up getting reversed and we follow that situation. And then we also have Elantris, which is also a standalone, and this was actually Brandon Sanderson's first published novel. This one is a little bit more romantic and politics heavy, whereas this one is a little bit more mystery heavy. Elantris is a city that used to be filled with godlike people, but for some reason one day it fell. It used to be that people were blessed by the Sheod, and that's how they became the godlike creatures that inhabited Elantris. However, when the city fell, the Sheod also changed, and now the Sheod doesn't bless people any longer, it curses them to turn into these zombie-like creatures that are neither living nor dead, and they get exiled to the city. And we follow a lot of politics in this world, and we follow somewhat the mystery of Elantris and what happened to it and its inhabitants. There is actually one more Sanderson book, but it's actually at the bottom of the pile, so I'm going to leave that till later. I also reread Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. This is actually the Scots edition that my sister picked me up while she was visiting Scotland a couple of months ago, so thank you to her for that. But yes, I did indeed reread Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and I enjoyed it. I'm not going to tell you what it's about because I just don't need to, do I? Then I also reread the first 4 books in the Mediator series by Meg Cabot, which I have spoken about quite a lot in recent months on my channel, but this follows a character named Suzanne Simon who can see and speak to ghosts, and it's her job to help them to move on. These are very short, middle grade books that I reread so many times in my youth, and I really enjoyed revisiting some of them this year. Then, in readiness for the Toll coming out, I reread Scythe and Thunderhead by Neil Schusterman, and can I just say that the audiobook for these was actually really great, and I kind of wanted to listen to the audiobook for the Toll as well, but I'm going to save that for when I reread it because I decided that I wanted to finish reading the series in the way that I started and read it physically. But if you don't know, this is also a future of the human race, also dystopian, and in this future of the human race, all forms of death have been eradicated, and now the only problem that faces mankind is population control. So the Scythedom was born as a means of effecting population control by murdering people, essentially. Scythes are ordained in order to murder people, and those people stay dead. That's the only way you die in this dystopian future. And we follow 2 apprentice scythes as they discover what it is to glean people, and also whilst they discover that there's actually a lot of internal politics going on within the Scythedom, and things are not necessarily quite as they might seem. Then, a book that I actually only read for the first time this year, and I loved it so much I reread it this year too, and that is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. And let me start off by saying that the audiobook for this is absolutely fantastic. So whether you've read this already or not, I highly recommend the audiobook. It's really great. But this book follows the crew aboard the spaceship Wayfarer, which is a tunnelling ship, which means that they create wormholes from one section of space to another. And the book is very episodic. Each chapter is sort of its own little mini story on its own, with its own beginning, middle, end and moral. And we get to know these characters really well, and I love all of them. It's honestly fantastic. It deals with such great themes. I've spoken about this book quite a few times on my channel this year as well. Fantastic, fantastic book. I also wanted to go back to the Red Queen series by Victoria Aveyard, which I first picked up when it first came out about 5 years ago. So I reread Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. I actually physically read this one. I think it's the only one here that I physically reread rather than rereading the audiobook or rereading via audiobook, so I can't speak to the audiobook on this one, but it's a very frivolous young adult fantasy story, but I do really enjoy it. We follow a girl from the slums who gets thrown into high society and discovers that she perhaps has powers that she didn't realise she had, and then she has to try and overthrow this society that is oppressing the people. Like I said, nothing groundbreaking here, but I like that. Another old favourite that I reread was The Magician's Guild and The Novice by Trudy Canavan. These are books 1 and 2 in the Black Magician trilogy. I still need to get to The High Lord, which is book 3. I've been a bit consumed by other rereads recently, but I do plan to get to it. The audiobooks aren't fantastic, but I do like them and I really enjoy this series. It's a high fantasy, not quite epic fantasy series that in the first book follows a character who is from the slums, discovers that she has magical powers and gets thrown into high society. Have we heard this before? Clearly I have a type, but in this one it's actually also a magic school setting, which is even better because I absolutely love a magic school setting, and this one is also magic school setting but also with a somewhat competition trope element, kind of a mystery thrown in as well. Really love this series. I've reread it many times and probably will reread it many more times as well. Another throwback now, we have Eragon by Christopher Paolini, which is book 1 in the Inheritance Cycle series. I think it's 4 or 5 books, can't remember. Never finished the series because I was reading them as they came out, and then I think the last one came out whilst I was in university and I just didn't do any reading whilst I was in uni because I didn't have time. So I restarted the series from scratch so that I could finish it, and I just got a bit distracted with reading lots of other things, so I hadn't continued with the series yet. But it follows a character who discovers a mysterious stone in the woods, and it turns out that that stone is actually an egg, specifically a dragon egg, and when that dragon egg hatches and the dragon binds itself to Eragon, he finds himself thrown into a war that he never anticipated being a part of. And it's not amazing writing. I think the author was 16 when he wrote this. It's not amazing writing. It's nothing groundbreaking at all. The author himself admits that he draws from a lot of classic fantasy in terms of the contents of this series, but I do want to go ahead and finish the series. So I want to carry on with my reread and then finish off the series, and hopefully I'll be able to do that in 2020. At the end of 2018, I was rereading His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, and so I didn't manage to finish it in 2018, so actually the first book I finished in 2019 was The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman, which is the final book in the His Dark Materials trilogy. And the audiobooks are actually narrated by Philip Pullman himself, so I think that that's really interesting, and I do recommend the audiobooks for that reason, because I think that it's always really interesting to hear an author tell their own story. Really enjoy this series. Again, have reread many times, will probably reread many more times. Then, similar story as with Eragon, I restarted The Alchemist. Well, this is called The Secrets of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel series by Michael Scott. As with The Alchemist, I was reading the books as they came out, but then they didn't all come out until I was at university, and so I never finished the series. So I reread this one, The Alchemist, which is book 1 this year, and I would like to continue with my reread of the series and finally finish it again, hopefully in 2020. This follows two teenagers who are pulled into a world they didn't even know existed. We are also following Nicholas and his wife Perinelle Flamel, who, yes, as you would imagine, are the creators of the Philosopher's Stone. And I don't want to tell you anything else about the plot because this is middle grade, so the plot is fairly simplistic, and I think it's better if you know less going into it. But it's also very mythology retelling heavy, which is something that I really enjoy about it. The audiobooks, again, not fantastic, but a good way to reread. I just wouldn't necessarily recommend them for a first time read through the series. And then let's finish off with two more Sanderson, shall we? Keeping it consistent here on the channel. Stormlight Archive. I reread the 3 existing books in the Stormlight Archive, starting with The Way of Kings, followed by Words of Radiance, and then finishing up with Oathbringer. I wanted to experience these on audio because Michael Kramer and Kate Redding are fantastic narrators. They also narrate some of Brandon Sanderson's other novels, and I just think that they're really, really good. So I really wanted to reread the series and also specifically wanted to reread them on audio, and yes, I do definitely recommend the audiobooks. I don't know that I recommend them for a first time read just because these are big, chunky, epic fantasy stories, and I think, at least for me, I absorbed the story better reading it physically the first time round, but for a reread, audiobook is perfect because they're chunky. I probably will reread them again next year before Rhythm of War comes out, but we'll see about that one. And then finally we have Skyward, which I read in readiness for Starsight coming out, listened to it on audio. The audio was absolutely fantastic. Sophie Aldred is an amazing narrator, and I highly, highly recommend, even reading it for the first time on audio, I highly recommend. She really adds that extra something and brings the story to life. I already was a massive fan of this book, and I think I'm even more of a fan having reread it on audio because it's just that good. I didn't tell you what the Stormlight Archive is about because, well, I've spoken about it so many times, and also it's epic fantasy and really difficult to explain. This one, however, is young adult sci-fi and follows a character named Spencer who dreams of being a pilot in a world where pilots are the pinnacle of society because the society she lives in values bravery, and who could be more brave than the pilots fighting the war against the Krell, who are threatening to destroy humanity. But the downside for her is that her father was a pilot, and unfortunately during a very big battle he defected and ran away, and so he's been branded a coward, which means that Spencer is also branded a coward because apparently cowardice is hereditary now, and we follow her struggle to defeat society's expectations of her, shall we say. It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it for anybody who likes YA, anybody who likes sci-fi, anybody who hasn't tried YA or sci-fi and would like to, or even if you wouldn't like to, just read it anyway because it's really good. And that's it. Those are all of the books that I have reread in 2019, at least so far. I will probably reread a couple more before the end of the year, but I didn't want to include this in my January wrap-up videos, so there it is. If I reread any others, they will be in my December wrap-up. And that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks! Bye!